Foundation, economic development. It's really an issue that we have not talked about at the foundation or as it relates to local governments. And so I think this is going to cover a lot of new ground for us and really kind of open up a lot of new avenues. I think most people will agree that a strong economy, robust job creation, rising incomes, these are all desirable goals. These are all good public policy pursuits. But where there is less consensus is figuring out the best way to make these things come about. Now here in Texas, what we've seen is a growing number of local officials have turned to the use of economic development policies to try and create an environment in which these things thrive. And so broadly speaking, economic development policies entail targeted incentives that are used in an effort to attract new jobs and new businesses to a particular area. And the use of these tools can include things like property tax abatements or the creation of business parks or land transfers, the use of tax increment financing districts or economic development corporations. There's a whole toolbox full of different economic development concepts. And when we look at the use of these tools in Texas, what we see is that they're becoming increasingly prevalent. Now, according to the Texas Comptroller, from 1997 to 2011, we saw the number of economic development corporations in the state grow from 336 to 697, representing roughly a 106% increase. On the property tax abatement front, we've seen the number of total property tax abatement agreements entered into by local governments grow from 758 in 2006 to roughly over 1,000 by 2011. And so the bottom line is that the use of economic development policies at the local level is growing, and there's a rising trend. And so what we've done is we've asked our panel today to take a look and answer whether or not whether the increasing use of these tools is cause for concern, or whether this is something to be celebrated, and whether or not this is the right policy prescription for Texas. And so with that, let me get out of the way. I'd like to introduce our first panelist, who is Carlton Schwab. And Carlton actually is the president and CEO of the Texas Economic Development Council and has been so since 1999. During that time, the 850-member TEDC has developed into a recognized leader in the professional development of its members and a powerful voice for economic development policy in the state of Texas. Please help me welcome Carlton.
Oh, okay. I didn't know we were doing it this way.
Oh, you're more than welcome to sit down.
Oh, okay. Do y'all want to get up or y'all want to sit down?
I was going to stand up probably.
You were?
Yeah.
Okay.
Whatever you prefer.
Morning, everyone. Nice day. No cedar fever on a day like today, right? With James' comments, our organization represents the economic development professionals and corporations in the state of Texas, and we're the largest association of economic development professionals in the country with about 850 members. And this year is the 25th year that we've had the economic development sales tax. And you mentioned the growth in the number of ED sales tax corporations in the state, up to just under 700. That law, passed in 1989, has been the difference maker in our state in terms of economic development. Because before the ED sales tax, most of our communities weren't involved in economic development in any way. What economic development there was done in the communities and towns of the state was done by the chambers of commerce, perhaps industrial foundations. It was done in a decidedly old way, if you will. The ED sales tax has enabled us to compete in the very highly competitive market for jobs. And as such, it really has made a huge difference. In a state as big and as vast as ours, we don't have a centralized approach to economic development. For example, I used to work in the corporate site location world. If you wanted to do a project in Georgia, you made one phone call, and that was to Atlanta. And someone in Atlanta, in the governor's office, said, okay, you're looking to build this kind of plant for this kind of company. Your sites are going to be in Athens, Augusta, Albany. I guess I can only think of the A-named towns in Georgia right off the top of my head. And then you went from there. Can you imagine doing that in Texas? It goes really against our tradition of local control and local support for most of the things that we do. So we have now, since the passage of that law, this wonderful tool at the local level that if you want to have the tax and you want to be aggressive in economic development, and you're in Ballinger, Texas, or you're in Longview, Texas, or you're in Wichita Falls, Texas, you get to control your destiny there as much as anything. It's on you and your community and the citizens of that community, the elected officials. And it's really set up quite beautifully. Jess has written a paper about transparency in economic development. Well, I would argue that the law could it use some tweaks? Probably. But as it's written right now, provides a heck of a lot of transparency because the projects emanate from the boards and they have to be approved by the councils and then as such move forward in their respective communities. So we've worked in the 25 years really, really hard on the economic development sales tax. We owe a great deal of gratitude in our state to Governor Ratliff, who was in the Senate at that time, sponsored that piece of legislation because it's enabled our communities to compete really with other states where the state might be more involved in the incentives that go into the project, whereas here we can bring to bear at the local level, based on local decision making, what kind of incentives go into the project. We're closer to the projects as a result, and thereby, I think, really offer a great deal of transparency to the citizens in those communities. So, I guess, is that all you want from me, or 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Let me just say that and Bennett's going to talk about this as well, I'm sure, but from our standpoint, representing the EDCs, the ED sales tax has been a gift. And for the communities that don't want it, they can always vote it out. I mean, that's the bottom line. If you're a community and you don't want the economic development sales tax, you think it's a waste of money, take it to the voters and vote it out. It's been done. But if you want the sales tax and you want a strong economic development organization at the local level, then move forward with it. Hire the best people, and do economic development to the best of your ability at the local level. And that's again, absent a lot of state involvement, at least until Governor Perry became governor. Absent a lot of state involvement, it's been a wonderful tool for the citizens of our state. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Good. Well, I'll introduce our next panelist, who is joins us from the Free Market Institute in Texas at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. He is Dr. Benjamin Powell, and he joins us today. And let's see, he is the North American editor of the Review of Austrian Economics, past president of the Association of Private Enterprise Education, and a senior fellow with the Independent Institute. If you would, please help me welcome Dr. Benjamin Powell.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here today to talk with you all. This is my first time interacting with Texas Public Policy Foundation, and I hope first of many more to come. I've just been a year in Texas now. We just started the Free Market Institute last January. We're adding new faculty members, doing a lot of programming in Lubbock. We aspire to make Texas Tech one of the premier places to do free market economics in the country. And I can't imagine a better place for doing it than Tech so far. That said, I also just spent 3 weeks in New England. I literally flew in last night and immediately jumped a plane down here. It's also nice to be back to Texas weather compared to New England. So I've done a lot of work on economic development. Admittedly, most of it's not at the local level. It's at the national and state level that I've done a lot of it. And I'd like to talk briefly about some of the lessons from that and then try to translate it back to the local level, which is the topic of our panel. Overwhelmingly, when we look around the countries of the world, what we see is those who do best in terms of economic development are those that are the freest, the ones who interfere with their economies the least, not the ones who do national economic development planning. Of course, there were some success stories, if you think back to like the early Asian tigers of the Taiwans that did national economic planning. But what people miss in that often is at the time when Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, for that matter, Japan, South Korea, when they were all transitioning post-World War II and going from really a poverty standard of living to becoming rapidly in a generation and a half a first world standard of living, they were also some of the freest economies in the world. They developed in spite of national economic planning, not because of it. Because ultimately the national economic planners don't know what industry to promote. How do we know what industry needs to grow? We need market price signals. Market price signals are entrepreneurs' evaluations of how they can take some resources that are scarce and valuable to other people, transform them into something that's more valuable. We use profit and loss as our signal mechanism to tell us, did we do a good job of this or did we muck it up? How do the national economic planners know in advance of that process which industries are in that nation's comparative advantage, or in the terms that they use, often competitive advantage? They don't. We need a market process to tell them, to tell us. When they want to point to an example of a success, simply pointing out that they subsidize an industry that is later in existence does not tell you that that was a success of planning. It is either redundant, it's an industry that could have grown anyway and been profitable, or it's actually a failure in that it couldn't have been profitable, and what they did is they subsidized it, which nothing comes for free. It means they took resources that would have gone into other industries and pushed it into that one, and as a result, the thing exists. Korean shipbuilding actually would be a great example of this. Every time they go to take away the subsidies, the industry starts collapsing. This is not a success of national economic planning. And in fact, actually, when we think of some of the great growth and success stories from those countries that were practicing development planning, they grew in despite of planning. Japan. What do we think of as the two industries that are most successful export industries of Japan? Electronics and cars, probably, right? Sony had to ask MIDI, the Ministry for International Trade, I forget the initials, MIDI for permission multiple times in order to get an export license. And the government kept saying, no, this is not actually in our nation's competitive advantage. They finally relented. Sony's a success story. Automobiles. The ministers at MIDI thought they should collapse all of the Japanese car companies into one in the 1960s. The industry fought against it, got around it, eventually became an export success story. The national economic planners simply do not have access to the information. And it's not that they're not smart enough, that they don't have a good enough computer. It's that the competitive market process is what generates the price signals that allow us to coordinate our scarce resources. Absent that process working, no planner, whether in socialist countries, in capitalistic countries, no planner has access to that information. So how does this translate around as we look at the world in terms of economic development standards then? We have something called the Economic Freedom of the World Annual Report, and it basically measures how governments interfere with their economies across kind of 5 broad areas. The size of government, how well they protect property rights, your freedom to trade internationally, the degree of regulation, and how sound your monetary unit is. What we find is overwhelmingly countries that are freer have higher standards of living, grow faster, and basically actually outperform other countries on almost any margin we care about, be it literacy, be it infant mortality, be it actually standards of living of the poor. So in the administration in Washington now, it's increasingly becoming popular to talk about inequality. What we find across countries, actually inequality varies very little depending how free market versus socialist you are. It's pretty constant across the four. What matters tremendously is how well do the poor live. The poorest 10% of the population in very free countries has a per capita income of around $11,000. Drop down just to the next 25 percentile, and that income drops to about $3,000. Go to the least free countries, and it's under 1,000. Basically, the poor do much better in more free countries. All right, let's leave the national level and come to the US level between states. The same problem that confronts planners on the national level confronts them on the state level. The planners in Texas or the planners in Oklahoma no better know what industry their state needs than the planners in Taiwan do. And when we look across US states, we can measure the degree of government interference in those economies. Happily, quite happily, as I'm standing here in Texas, we are one of the freest states in the United States. That is why Texas does so well, or one of the main reasons why Texas is doing so well. As measured by these indexes, Texas is either the second or I think fifth, depending which index you're using, freest state in the United States. Delaware comes in first, by the way. No accident that you see so many Delaware corporations when people get to choose where to incorporate. It's because they're free, not because they have great state development planners that attract the right corporations to Delaware. That's not it at all. They have low corporate tax rates, low overall burden of government, and corporations come there. Texas is experiencing much of the same. So what then about the local level? My message might not be particularly appealing to some of you, as I know much of this audience is staffers here in the state who your job is essentially to try to do something, but my message to you is give nothing a chance. The less you do, the less you do in terms of conscious development policy, probably the better. Provide an environment of low taxes, secure property rights. So actually, you want a development policy at the local level? Pass restrictions against eminent domain. Do not allow seizures of property. That's a big one. Post-Kelo, the way that the eminent domain has been used in the United States, and it's not just post-Kelo, actually. I mean, go back to Poletown in Michigan. The thing's been going on for 50 years. Kelo is not an anomaly. It just caught a lot of attention. Eminent domain for economic development is inefficient, and I would also add on a moral level, evil. If you want to do something for economic development, outlaw it and make sure your communities don't practice it. Because your development planners can't seize someone's property and know that they have a higher and better use. Incidentally, by the way, the Kelo decision, that's of course in New London, Connecticut, and it was seizing Susan Kelo's property among other people's property in order to plan a shopping mall for economic development. Because the justification was higher tax revenue would go to the community, that's going to be the public purpose of this. Do you know what became of that? It's a vacant lot. Actually, Reason did a great little thing where they showed, I think the title was, how to turn a nice neighborhood into a dump, because when the hurricane came up the East Coast 2 years ago, it was the storm dump for the city as they put all the debris where they had seized Susan Kelo's property before. So get rid of eminent domain, but more generally, keep your taxes low, secure people and property rights, and let what businesses have a natural competitive advantage to come to your area, do it. You don't have a free gift in terms of the economic development tax. It's not a gift. It's stealing from some members of your community to give welfare to other members of your community. That necessarily means discouraging some businesses at the cost of subsidizing others. Unless you can solve the knowledge problem of which industries are the best for your community, which incidentally you can't. We got something called a socialist calculation debate in economic theory that happened nearly 100 years ago now that says you can't solve this. Then what you're doing is basically blindly interfering with the plans of some to promote your own agenda. That's not economic development. Whether it's stadiums for sports or your favored shopping mall or bringing Walmart to town or discouraging Walmart from coming to town, that's not economic development. It's just blind interference with the economy. You want development, whether it be at the national level, the state level, or the local level, provide a good environment for entrepreneurs to work in, development will follow. Thank you.
Give nothing a chance. Ben, I think I might borrow that a time or two. our next speaker, though we may not always agree. Our next speaker brings a wealth of knowledge and experience. Bennett Sandlin is the executive director of the Texas Municipal League. Prior to being executive director, he was the general counsel for TML, where he helped cities through issues primarily in the fields of tax, economic development, budget, and general public finance. Mr. Sandlin also authored the Revenue Manual for Texas Cities and serves as an instructor in the Public Funds Investment Training Program. Please help me welcome Bennett Sandlin.
Good morning. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for coming to listen to this panel today. You know, economic development, when I saw the title of this topic, I was very intrigued. Is it on the backs of taxpayers? That's a very, very valid question. I speak to newly elected Texas City Council members and mayors every year on the topic of economic development, and the very first thing I tell them is, I guarantee you everyone in this room did not get elected to engage in economic development. In fact, half the folks in that room are opposed to the idea, and I'm good with that. I'm not here today to advocate for local or state level economic development, but I am here to talk about why it might make sense if that's right for the city. In other words, local control, or right for the county, which I think can be a valid topic if it's up your alley. And let me give you kind of a case study, and I'm going to give you the worst case scenario. You know what I hear when I hear about economic development critics, they say it's a giveaway. We're giving away public resources, and I'm very open to that argument. I think it can be a giveaway. Let me tell you a story one time I had. I won't tell you which city member it was, but I had a city official call me and say, you know, we've got this new manufacturing facility in town. They've already broken ground. It's a done deal. They're building this facility. And it dawned on us that we were going to give this facility a tax abatement, but we just forgot to do it. And they're here anyway. And the question is, Bennett, is it too late to give them a tax abatement? And I scratched my head and I said, oh my gosh, this is trouble. Of course it's too late. They're already there. That's the whole point. The first lesson of economic development from a local level that we teach is what I call the but-for test. But for the incentive that you're thinking about giving, is that business already coming to Van Army, Texas, or to Seguin, Texas, or to Texas in general? And if the answer is yes, you've got no business engaging in any kind of local incentive. It makes no sense. The whole point of economic development is incentivization for something that was not going to happen in the first place. Now, if you take kind of a broad libertarian perspective, you might say, even under that scenario, you should never incentivize business from a state-to-state basis or from a nation-to-nation basis. I can't argue with that too much if that's your philosophy, but I do think that in some cases it's right to compete with other states. I think it's certainly right to compete with Mexico and Canada and other countries. And here's the case. The poster child of economic development is the Caterpillar manufacturing facility that came to Seguin, Texas about 5 years ago. Caterpillar was looking to build one new plant. Caterpillar's not like a Walmart. They don't open 30 stores a year or 100 stores a year. They build one new manufacturing facility a decade or less frequently. And they had not only numerous states in the United States in mind, they had several countries in mind. Mexico was in the mix, Canada was in the mix, United States was in the mix. They're going to build one facility. So naturally, Texas and Texas cities were interested in attracting Caterpillar. And so this sort of puts it in perspective. Is it proper in that perspective to say, as Texans, we're going to compete for that facility knowing there's only one? It's not a fungible good. There's not going to be multiple facilities. Some city officials happen to believe it is, and for them, that's what economic development is about. So let's take the incentive that probably gets the most criticism, and that's tax abatement. When I talk to city officials, the first thing that comes to their mind is a giveaway. I'm never going to give a tax abatement because I'm going to get criticized for giving away tax dollars. So I'm going to walk you through that process. I may convince you, I may not convince you, but at least I'll tell you kind of how that incentive works and put it in perspective of attracting a Caterpillar to Seguin or a Toyota manufacturing facility to San Antonio. The way tax abatement works is this. If you're going to attract a manufacturing facility, what kind of land is Caterpillar looking for? Are they looking for a big subdivision that they're going to raise? Are they looking for the city to engage in eminent domain and tear down other facilities? Probably not. those organizations are looking for empty land. They're looking probably for ag-exempt land. It's probably 500 plus acres that they're going to purchase and put one of these manufacturing facilities on. So what Caterpillar does is they identify sites in different places. They identify a site in Seguin, they identify a site in Seattle, site in Mexico, and so forth. How much taxes, property taxes, do you think are being paid on a piece of ag-exempt land in Seguin, Texas, even 500 acres? Minuscule, probably $5,000 of city property taxes. I mean, just tiny little fraction. Here's the way tax abatement works. If Caterpillar decides to come to Seguin, Seguin gives a tax abatement. Caterpillar is forgiven or is not required to pay increased taxes on that land for up to 10 years. People think about a giveaway. Well, let's walk through it. If Caterpillar builds that plant, which they did, and they did get a tax abatement, they are still required to pay the underlying property taxes that the former owner were paid. Tax abatement cannot forgive what we call the baseline tax burden. So right away, Seguin and the county that Seguin's in and the school district is still getting 100% of the property taxes it was getting before Caterpillar came. The way tax abatement does, it forgives the increased taxes. What happens to the value of that land after Caterpillar finishes its facility? Goes up to $50 million. I'm just making up a number. So for 10 years, Caterpillar doesn't have to pay the property taxes, but only on the increase. Then what happens at the end of 10 years? It all goes back on the rolls forever and ever. You can never again give a tax abatement on that piece of land. It's 100% on the rolls. So backing up to my but-for test, what I tell city officials is you've got to do your due diligence. You've got to convince yourself that but for this incentive, Caterpillar is going to Monterrey, Mexico. But for this incentive, Caterpillar is going to Ontario, Canada. You've got to do that. It's tough. You've got to hire professionals. You've got to have people that know more than you do about the business climate, about site selection, and so forth. And if you answer the question yes, but for this incentive, they're not coming to Seguin, then are you really giving away something you never had? If Caterpillar goes to Ontario, what's going to happen to that piece of ag-exempt land? Are other manufacturing facilities lining up, out the door to move into Seguin, Texas? Probably not. It might sit fallow for the next 50 years. It'll remain a farm, and the jobs won't be there. So if you answer that question correctly, if you say to yourself the incentive is necessary to get this plant here and not go to Monterrey, Mexico, we're still going to get the same property taxes we were. We're just postponing the new economic development for 5, 10 years, whatever the term of the agreement. You're really not giving away property taxes because you never had them in the first place. They weren't coming to your town. So that's the message I preach. I still say at the end of that scenario, it's not a city official's job to engage in economic development. I don't encourage that. I just present the sort of the framework for how these incentives work. And that's the worst case scenario. Property tax abatement is the most unpopular of all the tax incentives, but I think there's a case to be made for that. One of the other criticisms we hear is about land. Texas is rich in land but poor in other aspects in some cases. And cities I represent, every city in Texas, and probably even the newest cities, you'll hear from Van Army in a minute, have numerous parcels of land that is unused. Every one of those pieces of land could be used for attracting a business if possible. What's interesting in Texas, and I'll just throw this out there, our legislature made it very difficult for cities to donate city-owned land to a business prospect, and maybe there's something to that. We are an oil and gas state, and in Texas, land is paramount. So what you don't see a lot of in Texas, and I appreciate the doctor's comments, you don't see economic development, eminent domain in Texas. It's illegal after the Kelo decision, but even prior to that, it's very rare, if ever, that cities engaged in commercial and manufacturing economic development. They have the opposite problem. They have acres and acres of empty land that if they could give it away, on each one, a Caterpillar plant plops down or a Toyota plant plops down, they would do so. But interestingly, our laws don't even permit that under current organizations. So I'm here today to tell you I'm not an advocate for economic development. I think it's an issue of local control. But I think if it is something that a city or a county or a state wants to engage in, by the way, the Seguin story was not just the city. It was the city, it was the county, it was the school district, and it was the governor's office that made that plan happen. And you say, well, what's the end result of this? Is it to create tax money? No, it's not. Seguin wasn't interested in the property taxes so much as they were interested in the jobs. Think about how many jobs a Caterpillar manufacturing facility creates, and they're permanent. That facility can't be packed up and moved somewhere. It's going to be there for the next 50 to 100 years at least. It's good for the state. And if you believe in competition amongst states and nations, then economic development is in the mix. If you don't believe in that, if you take more of a kind of a libertarian point of view, I probably don't have much for you today. I appreciate that view, and I'm not antagonistic towards it at all. It makes a lot of sense. But if you think that Texas ought to compete for certain limited manufacturing facilities and other things where there's not a fungible amount of them, like a Walmart or something like that, then I think there's a case to be made for wise economic development, provided you follow that but-for test, and that's what we teach city officials at our organization. Thank you for your attention.
Very good. Thank you, Bennett. Our next speaker actually is a bit of a case study in the use of economic development, but in a little bit more of a natural way. Our next speaker is Mayor Art Martinez, and he is the newly elected mayor of Von Ormy, Texas, a very unique city here about a little south of San Antonio. He's also a business attorney, a historian, publisher. He attended the University of Texas at Austin, a fellow Longhorn, where he founded the internet service provider AustinNet. In 2003, the mayor led an effort to organize the city of Von Ormy and was quite successful. He's the town's first mayor and among the youngest serving mayors in the United States. Please help me welcome Mayor Art Martinez.
Good morning, everyone. Von Ormy is a very unique city, as Mr. Quintero mentioned. We're a suburb of San Antonio, southwest of San Antonio. If you're familiar with San Antonio, we're on I-35 and Loop 1604, but on the southwest side, the part that most people don't go to. If you're on the way to Laredo, it's the first town once you leave San Antonio. I'm a sixth-generation Von Ormyan. We grew up there. That's my hometown. When we talk about economic development, you know, it's important to understand, and I think it's plainly obvious that every community is unique in its circumstance as far as where it's located, the cities that it competes with on a very micro level are the ones that surround it. And for a lot of suburban and small towns such as ours, we compete against large metropolitan areas, in our case, the city of San Antonio. Who have, from our perspective, an infinite amount of resources. They could drop more money on an economic development project than we have in our entire city budget. And so we had to take a very different approach to economic development in order to stimulate the tax base in our city. And so we took a very minimalist approach. We decided that there was no way we could compete on that level of giving tax incentives and abatements. So we set up a city where we have a public goal, we haven't got there yet, of zero property taxes. But we've cut property taxes 10% each year for the last 4 years. We have zero cost permitting, when every permit in the city is free. And we decided to structurally compete with San Antonio. And we've had a very large amount of success. If we can go to the first slide, which is a video. I don't know if you tap on it, if it'll work. Now the first one, this is actually a campaign ad, so excuse the political propaganda aspect. But I had no opponent. I don't know if they're going to work. If not, we'll skip over it. But it's a little introduction to the city. You know, if you just normally you just tap on the screen, it plays. I don't know if that's going to work. We'll have to skip. That's fine. We'll skip over it. If this won't work. Well, no political propaganda today. Well, we'll get back to Von Ormy. Here we are, Von Ormy, that big highway in the middle is I-35. We're 1,350 residents. We're now about 2.2 square miles through voluntary annexation. We're the most Hispanic city in Bexar County, 89.6%. 57% speak Spanish in the household. and our average drive time to work is 40 minutes. I mean, there's not a lot of jobs in our town. Get the next slide real quick. Our community was very, or is very underdeveloped compared to the other intersection of I-35 and 1604. If you look at the over here on your, I guess it'd be on your right, is the north side of I-35 and 1604, fully developed around the town of Live Oak. The main difference is sewer and infrastructure and those types of things. Von Army is primarily agricultural. So we decided to go approach things differently when we formed our city, which was in 2008. We did zero-cost permitting. We eliminated some of the sales taxes that San Antonio imposes on its outer areas, but doesn't provide service to it. Example being VIA, which is the public transportation. There's no buses to go out in the rural areas, but we still pay taxes on, or we used to pay taxes on it. We decided to set up the most minimal regulatory environment that we could. We spoke with some of our the large manufacturers that were near us, and one of their main complaints with San Antonio was the time it took in order to get things processed. They were saying things such as 6 and 7 months, and the cost of the delays were quite enormous. We run a virtual city hall. I mean, there's no physical city hall. We got a website. We're small enough. If you need something, we'll just go deliver it to your house. Everyone's got the mayor's cell phone. There's no need for that kind of infrastructure. I was a volunteer firefighter before I was mayor. It's one of the things everyone kind of does out in the country. So we took that same model. We have a city marshal's office. So we have 25 officers. We have a paid marshal and 24 reserve officers that are volunteer instead of a police department. Compare that to one of our neighbors, China Grove, similar size, similar budget. They have 2 officers for their city. We have 25. We're able to expand that. We equip them, we train them. And typically we have one retired guy who wants to do traffic patrol, and we have a rookie who can't get a job. We pair them together. Works out pretty well. And another example is animal control, which is one of the big issues in rural areas. We partnered with, there's a long line, probably more people than in this room that would sign up as far as animal lovers and animal rights groups. And so we partnered with some nonprofit rescues, and they function a no-kill animal shelter for the city, we have a no-kill rate of like 85 or something like that, which I hear is extremely high. So again, as a brand new city, we also have the additional burdens of setting up entire city services, but also the advantage of not having any kind of legacy costs or legacy structures. And so these are some of the things we put in. We can skip over that, but it's all your standard city services. And we also went about it, again, we have a libertarian, I don't think people call themselves that. They just call themselves country folks or whatever. But we're the only city in Bexar County that allows fireworks. We have no gun restrictions. We had a nice constitutional showdown over a nighttime curfew, which was fantastic. One of the council members asked for a nighttime curfew like every other city in Bexar County, and we had a nice discussion of the constitutional right to travel. Everything, we had some high school kids even come in and explain how the slave codes were based upon restrictions of travel, and that went down in flames. So we have no nighttime curfews. One of the few places you can smoke a cigar, drink an oversized soda. No fees for platting and subdivisions, which is a big draw into our city. No fees for building permits. Our most recent new business is a pilot truck stop, one of those mega truck stops with the subway. And they paid a total of $50 in fees to build that. They wanted a sign variance for their sign, and when that occurred, we didn't realize we actually had a fee for a sign variance, and we repealed it. But they did pay the $50 to speed it up. And of course, no fees for things like dog tags or whatever. And one of the little things that our residents like to call themselves is the freest little city in Texas. The next slide. We also do zero-based budgeting. We reevaluate our departments each budget cycle based upon what we utilize, what we need. We were able to save a lot again by getting volunteers for a lot of our departments. We consistently go under budget. Again, one of the videos that you would have seen is on KSAT 12 was an explanation of how the city operates using volunteers. It saves quite a bit of money. We have no long-term debt. And we pass all of our audits. That's more for our residents there. We've said some of that. We go to the next slide. This is the results of our minimalist approach to economic development, or at least a minimalist regulation. These are our sales tax receipts. You can see increasing dramatically over the last few years, primarily due to sales tax producing businesses moving into our community. I know a prior speaker talked about let the natural businesses come in into your area. We're a corridor city on I-35. The pilot that I mentioned before was actually going to locate a couple exits down in San Antonio's extraterritorial jurisdiction, but then when they learned about our regulatory environment, they said they saved approximately $50,000 in just construction costs and all of that, and so they located on our exit instead of 2 exits down. So our sales tax revenue was up 45% this year, and some of that's due to the oil boom and more people traveling down that highway, but also we have more locations to gather sales tax revenue, and 260% since we really started. And this is the result of our property tax valuation. Again, we started our city with a goal of eliminating property taxes. I don't like paying taxes. No one in our city likes paying property taxes. And in rural areas, in particular, you have a lot of folks on fixed incomes who have inherited land or agricultural land, and property tax is the sole threat to continued home ownership. So we see it as invasive. Hopefully we'll get there in the next couple of years, but each year that we actualize an increase in consumption taxes, we in turn reduce property taxes to reflect that. And here's an example of what we've been able to accomplish, again, with a full slate of municipal services. It's not really fair to compare us to San Antonio because there are 1 million people, but there's their tax rate. If you look at their INS rate just for all their long-term debt, and then more realistic are the other suburban cities of our size and composition, and still they're Somerset and Poteet, again operating on a borrow and spend methodology with very high property tax rates, in addition to the same sales tax rates that we have, the full 2%. And we've been getting noticed in the media quite a bit about our approach to municipal finances. I know we've had some other communities near us spring up. We have a city of Sandy Oaks. I think they're going to incorporate in May, inspired by us. We have a city of Savannah, which is on the Bexar County Escosur border. And I think people are starting to realize that there are other ways to go about city finances that doesn't place a heavy burden on the property owner, and we can do things a little bit more smartly. A lot of people ask us, where do we get this? Well, we didn't have one professional city planner or one MPA in the entire city. It was very organic, very much a grassroots effort to come together and start developing our community after a century of being ignored by San Antonio and Bexar County, and I think a little common sense goes a long way. So, thank you very much.
I'm always delighted to hear about success stories like Von Ormy. I think they paint such a great picture of the power of the free market. Well, the next part I like to include in our presentations an opportunity for the panelists to ask questions among themselves. So with that said, let me open up the floor to the panelists. If you all have any questions among yourselves that you'd like to pose, please take this opportunity now.
Sure. I'll make this a question by saying, don't you agree at the end or something like that. But it's more a reaction, actually, to the 2 presentations that came after mine. Particularly with Mr. Sandlin and I imagine many people thought there was a big contradiction between our message, and I actually think it's less pronounced than what it probably sounded like. Because taxes are distortionary. They stop businesses from locating in places where they should locate, and why you would raise taxes because Caterpillar locates in a place that's agricultural farmland, to me, is probably insane unless you can justify it by the extra cost of servicing that business in your community. So an abatement on that does not amount to planning. It amounts to not distorting the economy and letting firms come there that should come there. Where the message would be slightly tweaked, it actually comes in from our last presentation from the mayor, is the less servicing your city does of businesses, new residents, or anything, the better, because then your tax rate can be overall lower. And instead of picking whether we want Caterpillar or somebody else, you should have that base low property tax, ideally zero, or at least zero incremental for everybody. And if that's the case, you'll get the businesses locate there that should be, because the mayor didn't know whether Pilot should be there or Subway or Gulf or whoever. And if you provide that right environment, the right ones they'll come there. But the majority of the message I actually think is consistent. Just get the rate low for everybody so your taxes don't distort it. Don't you agree?
I do agree with that for the most part. I think that, at the city level, we're not advocates for one type of tax or another. Texas, for some reason, has chosen sales and property tax to be sort of the two-legged stool. And for that reason, both of those tend to be average or slightly higher than nationwide. And what we don't have in Texas is an income tax, so we have that advantage. I think most city officials, if the state legislature said we were going to swap out your one for the other and pay for police and fire and roads that way, they'd be fairly agnostic about that. So I don't disagree with that as a general premise. Property taxes are, at the city level, actually are quite low. The average city property tax is 50 cents. Von Army's doing a good job at 25 cents. But 50 cents is just a fraction of what the state charges to finance schools. So we give you police, fire, roads, and sewer for less than half the cost. And when I say state, I think schools are a state obligation under the Constitution, so I consider it a state tax. We're pretty good bang for your buck at the city level. So, but I don't disagree with that statement. What type of tax you have is not really a city prerogative. That comes to us from the state. So I know that this institute, this group supports a fairly broad consumption tax, a switch. That's worth looking at. You're not going to get opposition from cities. We still have to pay the police officers and the fire. So if you want to tinker with tax makeup, we're open to that prospect. We don't have any argument about that. But what we have now is property taxes, and you've got to go with what you got.
I would agree with you, Professor Powell, with Bennett's comments about what for. But here's the real question: are we willing to lose Caterpillar? Are local officials and state officials in this state willing to lose Caterpillar? Because the way the site location process works, when we in the state of Texas know that Caterpillar is looking at Seguin, and at that point in time they're looking at 3 or 4 other locations on the planet, and Caterpillar has determined at that point in time they can make money in Seguin, Texas, okay, but they can also make money on that plant in Alabama, in Monterey, Mexico, or as Bennett throughout Ontario, Canada. Those places may not be playing our game of let's lower our taxes, and if they want to be here or need to be here, they're going to come. They're going to write checks at that point in time or offer inducements for those companies. Are we willing to lose those projects? That's the question. Most city officials, most state officials aren't willing to lose the projects when we get that close to them. That's the question I ask you all.
So, I'm sorry, go ahead, Bill.
I guess the question I would ask is why would a city, or why should a city prefer Caterpillar over an agricultural business? I think when you look at the institution of property taxation, it comes out of an era of the state post-Civil War where the common medium of wealth was land ownership, and so that was I guess at the time considered the most equitable way to tax. I think in 2014, the most common medium of wealth is consumption, and so that's where you get some of these anomalies of preferring a Caterpillar because it produces property taxation over an agricultural business. Our community is 3/4 ag exempt, which we don't mind. I mean, 30 agricultural workers eat lunch at our restaurants just like 30 Caterpillar workers would be. And so I think at some point we need to reevaluate the imbalance, or we need to modernize the way we go about trying to most equitably tax the residents of Texas. and it's not through property tax.
So I think that's great, and keeping in mind my previous response, but we don't want our taxes to distort and drive away a business. So ideally, like your city has done, actually lowering it for everybody so you get the right ones in there. With that said, if we're doing that, would we be willing to use your phrase, to lose Caterpillar or anybody else? I would say we win when we lose. So indulge me as an academic for a little thought experiment here. Let's use France, of course, as an example, since they're socialist and evil. Since they subsidize Airbus to make planes. Let's imagine, though, that they subsidize not just Airbus, but every company that could possibly locate in, say, Austin, Texas. And we've already given them a low property tax regime here, so we're not distorting them away. And now France is saying, we're going to subsidize you so much that you'll come and you'll make Caterpillar in France, you'll make all these other things in France, and then you'll export it back to the United States. What they're doing is they're stealing money from some French people to give it to people who are going to give us products. Imagine they did that with every product we consume. Wouldn't that be cool? All of us would not have to work. We would get all of the products for free. We win. Now, let's say, no, we don't want that. We are going to steal money from each other in order to make Caterpillar come here and give them a subsidy. No, we're losing when we do that. The same is true on the margin as in the limit in the thought experiment. So when someone else actually forces resources away from some people to others, and this isn't a libertarian ideological point, it's about an economic efficiency development point, what you've done is distort development and actually retard your standard of living, not grow it. So we win when we lose.
Why don't we open it up for audience questions? Yes, sir.
First of all, quick comment to the mayor. Don't quit at being mayor. You're thinking all the way across the state. But the thing that the but for, addressing that, it's a great example, and I'm happy for Seguin that they got the Caterpillar plant. But I've watched it in their neighbor, New Braunfels, who would make a deal, to cut a deal to bring the biggest filling station, don't need to name their name, you probably know it, in the entire nation, entire world, to New Braunfels, where a friend of mine owned 13 filling stations in the same town, got no break. And that's what I'm saying. It's the abuse of power when cities get it that becomes the concern, where you take that large power plant, and then they make a very lucrative deal to a big Austin developer to come make it into an apartment locator, who competes with everybody else that doesn't get the break. And that's the thing that I think Professor Powell's pointing out, is that it's great when you point out the but for Caterpillar, but for 99% of the time, it is taking money out of the pockets of the rest of the residents to do something that's already going to happen in Texas somewhere. They weren't going to put that filling station in Mexico.
Well, there's a huge difference between a Caterpillar job and a Buc-ee's job. Yeah, and I agree with you. I don't think we should meet. This is where the professor and I would agree wholeheartedly. I don't think we should be incentivizing any retail. Okay, retail actually operates in the freest of markets, in a more free market than the Caterpillars of the world. I would argue. I'm not a professor. He'll probably shoot me down on that. But retail locates, it's the location decisions that they make, and when I include retail, I include restaurants, I include filling stations, I include the Walmarts and the Targets of the world. They locate based on rooftops, household income, disposable income. I mean, they just don't, Walmarts don't make mistakes. They know where they need to be. So when we incentivize them, I think that's where we're really in trouble. And I don't know, there's a website, I can't remember, I think it's Good Jobs First, which is a little to the left of, I think, most of the folks in this room, but they make the same argument. Why are we giving Walmart, I think the wealthiest corporation in the world, maybe with the oil boom, Exxon has passed them again, why are we giving them billions in incentives? That's a completely legitimate question in my mind. So I couldn't agree. Listen, I was born in New Braunfels. There's a lot that, if you notice right there on 35 next to Buc-ee's, the filling stations across the street, not getting any business anymore. And you're right, they didn't get any incentives to locate right there at the corner of 306 and 35.
Sir.
My question is for the mayor. First things first, it's just really refreshing to hear an elected official with that sort of an approach to economic growth as opposed to economic development. And I noticed that that was a subtle kind of difference there that I think we would be all well served by. My question for you is, being in Bexar County, I'm going to resist the temptation to ask if the mayor of San Antonio has tried to break your legs over this. But to what degree has what your town has done had a spillover effect and influenced or restrained the amount of shenanigans that your neighbors are able to pull off? Because if they try to pull too much, of this kind of central planning shenanigans, business owners can move to your town.
Well, I think it has had it has diffused into the neighboring communities. I wasn't present, but I heard a story recently that Lytle, which is I think the next town south of us on I-35, they were proposing a tax increase, and one of the residents came to the council meeting and said, "Well, Von Army's cutting theirs," and he got cut off real quick by the mayor. So, well, we're not Von Army, but but it is. I mean, we've got a city newspaper that kind of chronicles and kind of what we do, and it's interesting. We talk about. A lot of times we talk about public policy with regard to party. We had an interesting debate this past year where our Democratic precinct chair was one of the council members, and got into a heated debate with one of our Republican precinct chairs, also on the council, over how much to cut taxes. He said we didn't cut enough, and I had one of those moments where I had to stop the council meeting, and I was like, "Hallelujah! Everyone's working together towards the same goal." So it has changed the public discourse. As far as San Antonio goes, suburban cities are often, we don't have all the tools of economic growth or development, mainly utilities. Our electricity, our sewer, our water, all is controlled by the city of San Antonio. And where we see them work against us is where they take our utility rates, or the rates that we pay, put it into their general fund, and they use it against us when it comes to economic development. Case in point being with the oil booms, Halliburton, Weatherford, Schlumberger, all those big companies prefer to locate in South Bexar County, close to the oil fields, but away from the traffic and all of that of San Antonio. And in each of those three, one located in Von Army, two located in Elmendorf, were all pulled aside by San Antonio and offered more incentives to move into San Antonio, utility incentives. And again, so one of the complaints we have is that if they're going to be a regional utility provider, they need to utilize those resources on a regional level, which they don't. They use them against us. So we're looking at ways to form our own water supply and sewer. It's just a bigger project that we can chew right now.
Any more questions, Representative?
So I'd like to ask Professor Powell and Carlton a question. This is relative to what happened in Houston. I want to give you a little case example and say you were on city council, actually had to make a decision about these kinds of things. So a retailer was going to locate in one of two sites within a development. And there was a line in the middle called the city limits. And they said, hey, if we locate in the city of Houston, we'll want to get a tax abatement. But then we'll be in the city of Houston and we'll pay city sales tax. And the numbers penciled. The abatement was less than the revenues would be produced. But now in this case, we were subsidizing retail. The council voted yes. What would you have done and why?
Well, I can tell you what he would have done.
Go ahead, because you're going to make my job easier. So I think the mistake is with the framework that we're addressing it then, right? So what I agree about with these abatements is if the increment in terms of the services from the city that the business is going to demand is greater than the property tax that they're going to generate, we should not have taxes on them. But what we shouldn't be doing is doing it selectively and choosing Caterpillar or that retailer. We should be doing that for all of them. So whatever your projected reduced revenues would be, and I realize that it's not real reduced because they didn't exist before this retailer was there, you should be doing that for every business that could locate there, not just that one particular one. Did that answer your question, or did I kick it down the street?
You kicked it down the street. It's okay.
So actually, here's what I'd do. I'd vote yes, and then I would vote I'd put a next bill in motion that says, and we should do this for every other company that wants to locate in the city.
Well, I think, one of the reasons that there's such fierce competition in retail is that, in suburban Texas, the cities want the sales tax. I mean, that's why there's so much competition. Going back to my previous comments, theoretically, retail is not economic development. Retail is a result and a product of economic development because people have a certain amount of disposable income in the area to spend on retail. But the competition at the local level is a result between the political jurisdictions. What some states have done to eliminate that is, like for Arizona, for example, is you go to eliminate the subsidization, as he would call it, of retail in suburban Phoenix. When you go there and you buy you buy a product, they enter in your zip code. So if you're and then your jurisdiction gets the sales tax revenue from that particular store, but it does eliminate the subsidies and it does eliminate the incentives and the wars that communities get into over landing that Target or Walmart or Cabela's or whatever it might be.
So I agree wholeheartedly, by the way, that manufacturers are more flexible in where they locate than retailers, and that the subsidizations that you might do for a retailer are going to be less influential and more often a gift. But that said, retailers, not just in the inside city limits, outside city limits thing, but also there's a profit and loss test of should we exist in this jurisdiction or not, and one thing that goes into that is taxes. So what I'm in favor of is lowering the tax burden for retailers, for manufacturers, for all of them, so that we get the right mix in the town, because it is distortionary to retailers too, just not as distortionary as it is to manufacturers.
And retailers don't make the pie bigger, they just slice it bigger.
No, everybody makes the pie bigger. Listen, man, every time there's a new restaurant that opens in Lubbock, the pie just got bigger, literally and figuratively. This is
Very good. Yes, sir. You in the corner.
Hi, I'm Andrew Miller. I'm the British Consul General. I just want to put an international perspective on this. UK firms invest some $20 billion in Texas, making it the largest source of international investment in the state. Why do they come here? Where do they go? We see a lot of those through my office. The issues are very much the same as for domestic companies, with one major difference. The issues are, where's my client? Where's my market? They want to be close to it. They want to have workforce. That's going to be there. Then they want to have infrastructure and quality of life. And by quality of life, I mean traffic, transit, and all the other softer things. The big difference is about information. If you're a company operating in the UK, you don't necessarily understand the bureaucratic, legal, government regulatory environments here. There's a real role for government economic development agencies in closing that information gap. And it has to be done almost before that company has chosen to move. And if I wanted to see more of something, it would be economic development locally, getting engaged and getting active in spotting those firms they think should be locating in their region and reaching out to them before they've made that investment decision. And actually going to them and saying, this is a great place to come and invest. Your customers here, we've got infrastructure, we've got workforce. And then if you get down into the margins, you talk about taxation. But they're driven by closeness to markets, they're driven by availability of workforce primarily.
We need you to speak at our next conference.
Yes, sir. Judge.
This is probably for Mr. Schwab. Governmental entities that do engage in these economic development agreements that are protected under the Open Meetings Act then routinely go to the Attorney General and ask permission to keep them from being public knowledge. Would you comment on that, please? After the fact, once they are signed, agreed, and executed.
Yeah, I'm sorry, sir. I don't really know much about that. Can you give me some examples, maybe, of some cities that have done that?
No, I'd rather not. But
okay, so they're doing an abatement agreement, and
exactly,
then at some point, then they ask that that abatement agreement be.
kept secret
Bennett,
for
you
all
prob-
intents and purposes.
I think Bennett probably is better.
The
at
answer is it
answering.
should not be at the
Yeah.
end. Any executed contract is public record. The only reason for the upfront exemption is the same reason we exempt the negotiations for purchasing and selling property, is you don't want to give an unfair advantage to competitor. But once the agreement's executed, it should be public record.
Very good. Any more questions? Well, as we can see, this is such a multifaceted and interesting issue that the Center for Local Governance is going to be actively engaged in this issue over the next year. And I need to get a shameless plug in for our senior analyst, Jess Fields, who's done a lot of good work already. I believe we have a policy brief on your chairs that provides a quick overview of all the tools that are available to local officials, some of the more prevalent ones. And we've also got another policy perspective, I think, on the materials tables outside that speaks to the need for more transparency in economic development policies. With that said, folks, let me please join me and give me a big round of applause for the panelists today. Such a terrific job.